Okay, so I never know exactly when this actually goes live, which is why I'm watching it on YouTube as well. Let's see. Oh, hello everyone. So it looks like I'm live. I'm going to turn myself off so I'm not using all my bandwidth. Okay. Hello everyone. Welcome to, I think this is my first early morning stream in pretty much forever. And today we're going to talk about serverless. Please ask me questions in the chat room, wherever you're looking. I think this is live on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitch. Wherever you're live, ask me questions in the chat room. I should be able to see them in my unified chat room. If I don't see a question, I'm not sure. Ask me on Twitter. So here's how today is going to work. We're going to try to get as many questions from you guys as possible, or girls or people. We're going to try to get questions from you folks. If you come in, say hi, ask a question. I'm going to do my best to answer everything. We're going to look at my new book. That's kind of the point of this entire stream. And I'm going to show you a couple of demos and little examples that I've built for the Serverless Handbook. And then we're gonna get going. So let's start with Chimney Atterwalker's question, where he mentioned in the chat room before the stream started that he used Google Cloud Functions Firebase Cloud Functions for a project with a client, and there was some hiccup with billing, as always happens. It's not a big deal. Credit cards expire, stuff happens, and you don't pay a bill. But then Google messed up and he wasn't able to use his Cloud Functions for like 15 days, even though the billing issue was resolved. And his question was basically, why the heck does this happen? And the answer to that is Google has a terrible track record with good support and showing understanding to small developers. It's very common for Google to be like, oh, you did something weird, and then just ban your entire Google presence. That means your personal emails, it means your professional stuff, it means even your paid things. Paid stuff has better support than other Google stuff, but in general, I personally wouldn't rely on Google for anything important in my business other than email. They're really good at email, mostly because they're using it to data mine you and make a lot of money from ads. But in terms of their Firebase and stuff, it's really good to get started, but it's not, I personally wouldn't feel comfortable using it for serious production because, as I mentioned, any hiccup on any of your Google accounts can accidentally get everything banned and then your site is down. So because of that, in Serverless Handbook, I basically just mention Google as a provider of serverless solutions, but the book itself is mostly focused on using Netlify and Vercel as a quick way to get started with simple cloud functions. And then if you need the full serverless ecosystem, I always recommend AWS. AWS is the 5 million pound gorilla in the serverless space. I think they're pretty much the best at it right now. I don't know. I haven't tried Azure. I've only tried Google and Firebase for small projects. I haven't used them in real production, but like I said, I wouldn't. Whereas AWS has so far served me personally really well, and it's worked really well for all of the actual VC-backed startups that I've worked with, and it's used by large companies and so on. So the Serverless Handbook as such, and most of my advice when it comes to serverless relies on using AWS. And I like to use the serverless framework, which is open source, on top of AWS to make everything easier to manage. So I'm hoping that answers your questions, Chimney. If it doesn't, let me know in the chat room. Cool. John Howard asks if I have any good tutorials and links for people who are just getting started with serverless as a side hustle. And yes, I do. It is the Serverless Handbook. Let me make myself a little bit smaller. So we're going to talk more about the Serverless Handbook later, but it's meant to be like an intro to serverless that gives you a why as well, not just here's how to do this and a bunch of different recipes. It's really aimed at helping you understand backends and understand backend engineering, even if you're currently a front-end engineer or a very, very fresh to backends. The Serverless Handbook is designed to teach you like the mindset of how to think about backends, how to approach it in a serverless way, and kind of get you from the very first hello world examples all the way to building like huge data processing pipelines, authentication, and all sorts of stuff like that. And it's coming out, it's gonna be published on March 31st. I was hoping to share a pre-order link today, but unfortunately we had some delays in production, so there's not gonna be a pre-order link. Jimmy Nice Guy, I love that's a really cool username. Asks, what would be the best way to introduce super basic ability to change data, like toggling a Boolean value via Lambda to change the state of the SSG ISR NextJS app? The quickest way to do it. He currently has 2 different deployments on Vercel and can promote one or the other to production while on a run. Ideally, he would like to fire Lambda via Zapier or something that would change the Boolean value on the backend and cause Next.js to rebuild. So that is actually it's a more complicated question than it looks. There's a couple of different ways you can do something like that. First of all, it depends on where your data is stored as far as the backend goes. If it's stored in some sort of database, then you need to have access to that. I'm assuming you already do because you said you have the Next.js Lambdas are able to read from that. I know that Vercel has a hook that you can post to that triggers a reload, or triggers a rebuild. So if you're using Vercel for the front end, there's a Vercel deploy webhook. Vercel deploy webhook. There we go, deploy hooks. So if you have a hook, you can basically make a Lambda. I've done this in the past. You can make a Lambda that, oh, sorry, I'm showing my screen, but my camera is in the way. Switching my camera right now is a little slow because I can't use complex shortcuts because this is a cast. So basically, Jimmy Nice Guy, what you do is build a Lambda, kind of similar to, I'll show you a similar Lambda that I have, and you make a post request to a fancy URL that Vercel gives you, and then that triggers a rebuild of your app. Exactly. So it's not just you can fire Lambdas with webhooks, you can use Lambdas to fire webhooks as well, which is a cool approach. So since we're right here, let's see, do I have, oh, why don't I have a third-party API example here? Okay, I'm gonna open a different example that I have in, please let me know if you can't see what I'm typing. So I'm just gonna show you an example that I hope still works for using third-party integration. Okay. Cool. So Jimmy Nice Guy, yes. If you have something that makes the database change, that can also fire a webhook, or you can add some sort of change listener to your database. Chimney asks, should he be using Lambda instead of Firebase Cloud Functions? Yes, I would recommend using AWS Lambda instead of Firebase Cloud Functions, mostly because it is more, like I said earlier, Firebase is designed more to be a platform as a service rather than, and they try to do everything for you. It's similar to something like AWS Amplify, from my understanding. Whereas AWS Lambda is more about giving you all of the control and letting you deploy code on those Lambdas. So let's look at that first. We're gonna start with a Hello World example and just show you what it looks like to build a simple Lambda and how it runs and what it deploys when you put it in production. And then I'll answer Joshua's question. So let's see, a basic Lambda, Serverless Handbook examples. If we go to Hello World, I'm going to open it here. What did I click? No. So if I open the Hello World example, now Chimney can tell me if this is more or less simple than Firebase, because I haven't used Firebase Cloud Functions specifically. So a basic AWS Lambda, I hope that's zoomed in enough. Basic AWS Lambda is just a JavaScript function that you export from a file. It can be an async function or it can be callback based, whichever you prefer. I like to use async await because it's now available in all Node.js environments. And yes, this is running Node.js when it's in production. And here I have an example of reading a query string parameter from the event that triggers the Lambda. In this case, the event is going to be a HTTP request that we're going to fire in the browser. And we return a status code and a body that just says hello world to the person asking. When you using the serverless framework, you can set this up as a function with a YAML configuration. That part can get pretty hairy, and some people say that YAML isn't a good idea. I personally like YAML for simple things, and I haven't. Something about having Turing complete cloud configuration built using JavaScript kind of scares me, because I'm almost certain I'll get it wrong and there's going to be a lot of bugs. Whereas YAML works pretty well for simple things. And in general, I think you should keep your configuration simple and declarative rather than super complicated and based on state, because that's where, when it's based on state, that's where you get into trouble with the whole function infrastructure as code approach. So infrastructure as code means that all of your code is, all of your infrastructure configuration is co-located with your code and uses the same sort of version control and that kind of stuff, so that you always have it. And I talk about this more in the serverless developer experience or developer design chapter, but basically the idea of infrastructure as code is that you put infrastructure where it belongs with your code, so that you can have different copies for different branches and different environments, and it always works rather than having to go around AWS and clicking things. So if I run a deploy for this, I'm going to run SLS deploy. That's using the serverless framework, and it's going to deploy this function on production and give me a URL that we can call. We can also invoke it locally, but it's more fun if we deploy it first. So let's see. Checking stack update progress. This part can sometimes be a little slow because I'm streaming, but it's pretty fast when you're using it for development. Like deploying serverless to the serverless environment and testing live in production is fast enough that I've been able to use that as an actual iteration and debugging process. You can also call things locally, but only production is like production. So if we now go to this URL that serverless spat out, we're gonna get my serverless function that says hello. And if I add, let's zoom this in a little bit. So it said hello. If I add name equals, let's say Chimney, it's gonna say hello Chimney. So that's our hello world example. And what's cool is that I can go to AWS and check everything that got set up for this, just from this small function and the basic configuration. Now, hopefully you won't see anything that you're not supposed to see in my AWS console, but it should be fine. So if we go to Lambdas, so Lambdas, I can then find my hello world Lambda, hello world dev hello. And you can see that it's 277 bytes. It's running on Node.js, and it has an API gateway configured to work as the public URL. And if you're familiar with traditional servers, it's acting as a reverse proxy that then calls my Lambda, which fires up a whole new server just to say hello world. And what's really cool is that with serverless, firing up those new servers is fast enough. This was a very cold request, but it was pretty quick. I know I didn't see any delay. And if we look at it now, obviously it's a small function, so it's always going to be relatively fast, but you get the whole response back in 200 milliseconds, which is pretty good. It's not like if you're doing trading on the stock market and you need super quick, super high performance, serverless might not be for you. But for APIs, I think it's a great fit. Now let's see, what is Jimmy Nice Guy saying? Okay, so Philip Halim asks, why am I using the serverless framework instead of AWS SAM? And the main reason that I'm using serverless framework instead of AWS SAM is that I prefer the syntax of the serverless framework. It's a lot easier to do the easy things than it is with AWS natively, but it still lets you drop down into native AWS configuration when you need to. So the serverless framework, in my experience, gives you a nice balance between making the easy things easy and the complex things possible. Whereas with AWS SAM, everything, at least from what I've seen, everything is kind of hard and annoying from the get-go. And serverless also, now they have, I forget what they're calling them, but they now have components that you can just compose with serverless, and that's also easier than using AWS SAM directly. Oh, and yes, and what Jimmy Nice Guy says, serverless, at least in theory, supports different clouds. So you can use the same serverless configuration to deploy to Azure, to AWS, and I think some other stuff as well. I haven't really explored that as much, but in terms of just AWS, I like that the simple stuff is easy and the hard stuff is still possible. Now, we had a question earlier from Joshua Mitchell. I hope he's still around. It was 8 minutes ago. I don't know how often people jump in and out of these kinds of streams. So Joshua asked if I can talk about the pros and cons of freelancing with serverless or as my specialty, or perhaps freelance software engineering in general. That is a great question, Joshua. In terms of freelancing in general, if you are definitely going to benefit from niching down. That's a phrase you can search. Is called if you're getting started with freelancing, it's a good idea to Google for a phrase called niching down and positioning. The reason you do that is because when you do your positioning very well. So for example, you could say, I am a freelancer who builds serverless backends for Jamstack websites for Series A startups. That is a great positioning statement. I haven't checked if there's enough market for something like that, but it means that you are a specialist, an expert in something specific. So whenever somebody says, I really wish we had a serverless backend for our site so we can do some quick saving, some quick data saving and or like email signups and things like that. Oh, I forgot to make myself big again. So if you are the expert in something specific, whenever somebody has that issue or has a question with something like that, they know to reach out to you. Other people can also recommend you. When somebody goes to a freelancer who works with React, for example, and they say, hey, we need this extra functionality that is on the backend. The React person can say, I do React. I am not that great at backend stuff. Go ask Joshua. He is amazing with serverless, and we know how to work together, or something like that. Basically, having a specific niche, specific positioning that you work in as a freelancer, just makes it a lot easier to recommend you, makes it a lot easier to hire you. It does mean that you have fewer potential clients in the world, but honestly, how many clients do you actually need? At the end of the day, it's not like you need 50 people per day to hire you as a freelancer. You probably need one every couple of months because these projects end up taking a long time. And we could talk more about that, but let's focus more on serverless. So Joshua, I hope that answers your question. Yeah, I hope Joshua that answers your question. Now, Chimney asked to see the actual book. So let's do that, and then maybe there's going to be more questions. I'm going to have some more tea. Let's see. Can I make myself even bigger while I'm showing you the book? can. I just hope I don't become blurry at some point. Okay, so the Serverless Handbook is an actual physical book. It also has a digital version online. There's what you see right here is the latest test print. I'm getting a new one in a couple of days, and this is pretty much what the book is going to end up looking like when it's published on March 31st. I was hoping to share a pre-order link. I might get a pre-order link later this week, depending on how the setup with my publisher goes. So if you go to if you're already on my mailing list, or if you go to serverlesshandbook.dev and sign up here, you will, oh, my camera is inverted. Okay, let me disinvert myself. Okay, see, because I am inverted so that it looks like I'm looking at my monitor, because my screen, see, now it looks like I'm looking away from what I'm showing you on the screen. So that's why I keep myself mirrored. So it should no longer be mirrored now. Good call. So it's going to come out on March 31st. This is a test print. That's why there's a typo in here somewhere. If you sign up on serverlesshandbook.dev, you're going to get a notification when it goes live, and it's going to, we couldn't get pre-orders in time. We might get them later this week. It's about 360 pages of color print, which I think is really cool. And it has all of the content that you also get if you buy the online version. So it's a digital and a paperback. The paperback is going to be available on Amazon and I think Barnes & Noble. Basically, wherever books are sold, I'm going to try getting it in physical bookstores as well. And it should be available to ship anywhere in the world. That's the idea. The print shop I'm using has printers all over the world, so shipping shouldn't be, I'm hoping that shipping doesn't end up being expensive, because we can print the book very close to you instead of printing everything in the US and then sending it to you. It has a really beautiful cover that was designed by Stas Kulesh on Twitter. There's a back cover as well. And I really like that. I don't know how well you can see it on camera, but this rolls around and I just love the way that looks. It's a really small effect, but it's amazing. What else? So yeah, it's 360 pages, all printed in color. It's kind of hard for me to show right now because of my broken wrist, but you get, broken wrist is a problem. So it kind of looks like this on the inside. I did my best to include all of the GIFs and funny things from the online version. Obviously, in the book itself, they don't, like if you get the paperback version, the GIFs don't move, but you get all of my beautiful hand-drawn sketches. Maybe not beautiful, but expertly drawn sketches, which means drawn by an expert, not drawn expertly. I did my best, but I used to be an artist, but I'm not an artist anymore because I took an arrow to my wrist. That's a bad joke. I hope somebody found that funny. There's code samples in here that you can read, and the book also if you buy the paperback, you get the online version for free. So if you're gonna go to let's see, can I get that to focus? There we go. So that specific page is not live yet, but it will be very soon. You'll be able to go to the what's it called? You'll be able to go to serverlesshandbook.dev/claim to get the digital version of your paperback for free. And the reason you might want to get the digital version is because it comes with interactive examples, moving GIFs, and what I personally really like in code, it comes with clickable links and copy-pastable code. So let me show you an example. Let's see if we go to the, and I'll walk you through the chapter list. Actually, yeah, let's walk through the chapter list. Yeah, so Jimmy Nice Guy said that I could have used a flipbook animation for the book and have animated GIFs. But imagine how expensive it would be to print a high color 1500 page book. Nobody would buy that. It would be really cool though. So let's. What do you guys think? Should we open a celebratory beer at 9:30 a.m. because this is coming out soon, or should I wait until it's actually out? It's always a tough question. I do feel like we've gotten very far with the book. I have to get to work after this. Screw it. Okay, so I'm gonna open a celebratory beer to go with my book walkthrough, and then we're gonna do a walkthrough of all of the chapters in the book, so you can see what you can learn from this. Okay, so while I'm opening this, Matthew is asking for, and I'm getting a really nice beer. I don't know if anyone here is into beers. I used to really hate beer until I tried the Chateau beers from Belgium. It is a completely different experience. If you've never had one of these guys or something similar, I highly recommend it. It's very, very different than the usual beer you buy at the grocery store. And actually, the first one of these I had that taught me that beer can actually be tasty was in Belgium, where I was when I was camping, and the campsite had their own beer that they were making but I think the monks at a nearby monastery were making it. Okay, so it turns out that this shit is hard to open when you don't have two hands. Well, I might not have a beer. Okay, so much for my celebratory beer. I can't open it. Well, sorry everyone, I am not going to get buzzed with you today because I can't open my beer. Vivas890, I don't know if that was a question or if you were making a comment on how I'm going to break my other hand, but I broke this hand when I was snowboarding 3 weeks ago. So 3 weeks ago, it was my first ever time snowboarding, and on my third run down the bunny slopes, I fell in a weird way and broke my hand. And it did not require surgery. It does not look like it is going to need surgery, but yeah, the CT scan looked pretty cool. Okay, so let's do a walkthrough of the book. Like I said, nice. Micha, I'm going to explain that in just a bit. So actually, let's answer Micha's questions first. How to set partition key and sort key in DynamoDB? That's a really good question. I don't think I've actually experimented with that too much. I've only used normal hash keys with DynamoDB. So I'm actually going to look into that some more, and I will ping you. Are you on Twitter, Micha? I'll look into it and I'll give you a good answer because I don't want to pull something out of my ass right now. We do talk about DynamoDB in Serverless Handbook, but we don't go into crazy details. So yeah, I'm going to have to look into that. Anyway. Like I said earlier, the Serverless Handbook is designed to be not so much a tutorial cookbook where it's showing you how to do specific things, and then you get your own project and you're like, what the hell? I have no idea how to apply what I just learned. Instead, it's designed more as a why book and a why and a mindset book. So there's a lot of things that talk to you about how to think about certain approaches, how to think about serverless, how to think about the backend stuff, what are the caveats, what are the pros and cons, rather than do X, do Y, do Z, and then you get a product. So the book has 20 chapters in total, 19 chapters in total. It starts with I'll talk about that in a bit, Gabriel. Thanks, Micha. So the book starts the book is designed to talk you through from a complete beginner in backends. If you're a front-end engineer, if this is your first time building backend code, we start with just getting started, which talks you through a bit of the history of serverless and why it exists, what it does, and how it's different from other approaches of hosting your backend code. And then it finishes off with building your first hello world example. You see, this is a case of, hey, Igor, this is a case of how dynamic moving GIFs are nice in the digital version, whereas in the book version, they're still there. I made them useful, but they're not moving. So you get your first, you basically build your first hello world lambda in about 5 minutes. And then next chapter talks about the serverless pros and cons. There we go. So serverless pros and cons is a chapter that talks about when you should and when you shouldn't use serverless. It mentions that that the whole thing is an ecosystem, that it's not just about lambdas. There's a whole world of serverless. It mentions the saving time, programming productivity. It talks about how it can be cheaper than traditional servers, how it scales, and then about the cons, which are like Gabriel Foro mentioned in the chat room. He asked if there's a problem with cold start for apps. And yes, it depends. If you have very, very low traffic, but you need every request to be super high speed, then serverless is not a good choice for you. But if you have like moderate traffic, or if you can afford to wait like 100 to 200 milliseconds for cold starts on first requests, then serverless is a great choice. It's the cold start problem is not as high in serverless as it is in traditional shared hosting or with Heroku, mostly because the servers themselves are so much smaller. If you do it right, a specific serverless endpoint is just one JavaScript function that does one specific thing. The slowest work it has to do when it's cold is having to connect to a database. So as long as if you're not connecting to a database, you shouldn't worry about cold starts at all. I also wouldn't recommend using something like Java or a JVM-based language because the Java runtime takes a long time to start up. Whereas with JavaScript, it turns out it's pretty fast. I've seen really good performance in my experience. Martin asks where to go to hire serverless developers, and I don't actually have a good answer for that. The problem, I don't think there's a dedicated job board for serverless developers yet. It's a relatively new field, but I'll try to look into that and give you some ideas. Yeah, sorry, I don't have a good answer for that yet. So yeah, after we're done talking about the serverless pros and cons in the second chapter of the book, the third chapter compares some of what we've been talking about earlier in this stream is AWS, Azure, Vercel, Netlify, or Firebase. Which of these providers should you use? And it kind of talks you through the pros and cons of each. Oh, there's a missing image. I'll have to fix that. So it talks you through the pros and cons of the different providers, what they give you, what they don't give you, what they're meant for, and it ends up depending a lot on which of them you feel like you're the target customer for. AWS is kind of more general. Netlify and Vercel are targeted at people who are doing quick and easy things. Firebase is targeted at folks who are doing more whole platform as a service approaches. And Azure, I think like honestly, to me, it looks like Azure just exists for people who cannot use AWS because of like because Amazon is their competitor or something like that. I'm half joking. So after we talk about the different providers, the next chapter of serverless talks about how to create a good serverless developer experience, gives you some tips and tricks that have worked for me in the past, and also talks about what you should be aiming for. Like I've been saying, this is more of a why book, so it tries very hard to give you the mindset of what you should be targeting for rather than being very prescriptive of here's what you need to do. Because I find that the details of what you need are very different between different companies and different projects and even different people, whereas what you're aiming for tends to be more universal. Yeah, so exactly as Jimmy Nice Guy said, they're using Azure at his work because they're already using a lot of Microsoft and because they have specific security requests that AWS is not providing, which I think is often code for AWS wanted to charge us too much to sign an SLA, and we negotiated with Microsoft and got embedded with them. But those are all very like VP of engineering level decisions. Where it's like, yeah, I went to the golf course with this dude who works at Azure, and now everybody needs to use Azure. Martin asks, what is my preferred cloud provider for serverless? For me personally, I have enjoyed AWS the most in terms of actual serverless for hosting my front ends. So the code that you see, I like to use Vercel. So the Serverless Handbook itself is hosted on Vercel, but behind the scenes that actually uses AWS for a lot of things. Okay, so the 1, 2, 3, 4. The fifth chapter is called Architecture Principles and talks about the principles of how to think about uptime and some about performance, and just how to think about distributed backends, how to put things together, what you're looking for to design an architecture that's not going to flop over at the first sign of trouble, and basically how to build something that's actually going to stand the test of time, handle various errors and other things that always just end up happening. This is a very much a mindset kind of chapter. Then we go into lambdas, queues, gateways, and more, which are like the elements of serverless. And the book talks about what is a cloud function, what is a lambda, how to create them, how to use queues for distributed data processing, or just what they're for, how to define them using serverless framework. Here you can see an example of how serverless framework lets you drop down into native AWS configuration for the more complex details. And we're using, I can't remember I think this is SAM, but it might be CloudFormation. I always get those two mixed up, where it's basically resources and then you define everything lower down with AWS native syntax. Then we talk about how to process a queue. We're talking about API gateways, how they work as reverse proxies to guard your lambdas from the wild internet. Talk about S3, CDNs, a little bit about logging, and basically those are the important elements that you get in the serverless ecosystem. Then what follows is a chapter that seems kind of similar to the architecture principles chapter, but is more designed to be a how version to the why of that. So it talks about the two generals paradox and why you will never have a fully reliable backend, and then gives you some ideas on how to engineer your things and how to think about the different aspects of your backend so that when they work together, they're going to be relatively reliable. So you can actually reach reliability that's higher than the base platform that you're using. I was able to do that in a couple of projects. But I'm not gonna lie, it does take some work and thinking to get there, and a lot of fiddling and experimentation. But the robust backend design chapter gives you ideas and approaches for how you can actually achieve that. Then comes one of my favorite chapters, and I don't know how good the microphone is at filtering that out, but my bird is screaming in the background. Please let me know in the chat room if you can hear him. So the where and how to store data chapter talks about not just serverless databases as such, but it talks about databases more in general. I feel like this is an area where, especially front-end engineers or more people who are more recent to the whole backend, the understanding can get very fuzzy. I had the fortune of growing up through most of the life cycle of the different database technologies that are popular right now. So I saw how they became hyped, how they are falling out of favor and all of that. And I kind of tried to capture all of that in this chapter. So the chapter talks about how to use flat files as a database, how to use traditional databases like Postgres, MySQL, and so on. It talks about the NoSQL stuff, primarily focused on the pros and cons of everything, and even mentions what the blockchain is and isn't, and how you can use it as a data store. Now, the original version of this chapter came out to be, I think, 5,000 pages long. 5,000 words long, because it turns out I have a lot of opinions and experience with dealing with all sorts of different databases. So I shortened the chapter and put everything else in the appendix. So if you want to have a really deep dive into how databases work and how you should use them, the appendix is for you. If you just want to get a quick feel for which database to choose and when to use it for different problems, then the databases chapter is for you. Now, from here, we go into a couple of more how-focused chapters. And please stop me in the chat room at any point if you have questions. So the creating a REST API chapter is very, it's funny. It's like people are just dropping out because I'm doing a walkthrough. So the creating a REST API chapter is very tutorial based. It's kind of a tutorial on how to build a REST API using serverless, and it uses different lambdas for every endpoint and a couple of other good practices from my experience. If you follow this chapter, it literally comes out as a tutorial, and you will end up building a very simple CRUD that is a create, retrieve, update, delete API using REST, and you're going to have it running on your AWS or Azure if you change the provider. So you get that, and then followed from the REST API. Part of the REST API chapter is also talking about what counts as REST, how you should design a REST API, and when to use a REST API, like when is it a good fit for your problem. Then comes the GraphQL chapter, which also talks about what is GraphQL, why GraphQL is a good idea, and when you should use it for your projects. And then talks about how to implement a GraphQL API using serverless. Here we're leaning heavily on the Apollo Lambda library. But it teaches you both how to use GraphQL as a consumer and how to use it as a backend developer who's providing a GraphQL API, and talks a little bit about how to design it, and then gives you a full-on tutorial of building a simple GraphQL API that corresponds to the REST API that you built in the previous chapter. These are kind of very tutorially, which I think in this case is great. Then comes another more of a tutorial-based chapter talking about using Lambda pipelines for serverless data processing. Now, there's a bunch of different ways that you can approach this. the way I approached it, yeah, there's a bunch of different ways you can approach using distributed data processing in serverless. This is a pretty low level approach. So and I talk about when you should switch from something like this to using Kafka or Hadoop. But this is a great example of building a robust architecture using everything that's using a super decoupled approach and queues for processing data. You can use that for all sorts of things like processing events or going through videos and whatever you might need. It really depends on what you're building. The chapter itself is focused on the basics and the core approaches of how you might do something like that. Whew, I'm talking a lot. Then we talk a little bit about monitoring serverless apps. This one is also not as prescriptive as some of the other chapters. It's more about what you should look out for, what's your end goal, and talks about an approach that has worked for me one of the approaches that has worked best for me in the past. From there we go to what often trips people up, which is how to think about different environments, different approaches to working on a project as a team or as a solo developer. And it talks about kind of the 3 or 4 different approaches that people usually end up with and what their pros and cons are, and also shows you how to implement each of those in your project. Serverless performance is again touching on some of the questions that you guys have asked in the chat room about cold starts and speed and scalability. So that's the serverless performance chapter. Talks about what's important, how to think about things, and where you're most likely going to end up losing time and performance, and it's usually input-output. And then we have another really cool chapter that's more of a tutorial that talks about how to run Chrome Puppeteer on a Lambda to make screenshots or screenshots or web scraping. Oh, that's a nice GIF. So fun fact, I don't actually know in advance all of the GIFs that are going to show up in the book because it's using, hi Grubnala, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. So the Serverless Handbook platform that's also used for my other courses actually makes a new Giphy search every time I deploy. So these GIFs keep changing and they're kind of just generally on conveying an idea, but they're always different, which I thought was cool. So the Chrome Puppeteer chapter talks you through how to use Chrome on Lambda for either web scraping or generating images. Then we talk about how to handle secrets, which is very important. I once mishandled my secrets and AWS actually locked my entire AWS account because one of their GitHub scraping bots found my API keys. So that was fun. My whole AWS almost got banned. Lots of fun. So we talk about how to handle secrets so that doesn't happen to you. We have a chapter on authentication, how you can build authentication, what's important when it comes to authentication, and you build a tutorial example of rolling your own auth, which I think is pretty cool. And as a final chapter, we have a glossary that kind of goes through all of the terms that are used throughout the book that might be unfamiliar, that you can then look up at the back of the book. The glossary and everything that's online is also in the paperback version. And like I said, if you buy the paperback on Amazon or wherever you get your books, it's going to give you access to the digital online version as well. And there's going to be PDF and EPUB downloads for people who like that kind of thing. Personally, I think the website version is the best approach to doing digital because it gives you interactivity and everything, but some people have asked to download PDFs so that they can have a worse version of a paper book, which I don't know why, but I aim to please. yeah, so that's the walkthrough for the book. And now Grubnula has a question. How to handle more complex database queries where you would normally use an ORM and models. How to share those between functions. That is a great question, Grubnula. One approach I've used in the past is to use SQL query. So I'm going to assume you're talking about a Postgres or MySQL database, not about DynamoDB or something like that. So in my experience, at least until recently, a lot of the JavaScript ORMs for, a lot of the JavaScript ORMs for databases have been pretty bad and kind of poorly. They're maintained okay, but I found that usually it's been easier to just write SQL queries directly. So I've used NotePG in the past to create a connection pool and share that connection pool between different invocations of the Lambda. That makes it faster to connect to the database so that you get less of a cold start problem. Or at least if you have multiple Lambdas running in parallel, they can share their connections and that makes it work faster. And then I was writing just plain SQL queries. And like I'm sure you know, that the painful part with writing raw SQL queries is the translation between SQL, the SQL response and the JavaScript data models that you have. That kind of sucks. And I haven't found a really good ORM for that. However, Prisma has been making huge improvements over the last couple of months. So I need to try Prisma, but from what I've heard, it is the currently best answer that we have to this. Like Gabriel Foro said, SQL is best for querying relational data, and that's true. Where SQL struggles is translating that relational data into JavaScript objects that are easy to consume in your code. And Prisma does a really good job with that. I haven't tried it yet personally, but from what I've talked with other people who are building this kind of stuff, Prisma is currently the best in class. So that if you're on a new project, that's what I would recommend. If you're using an old project, then the best approach is to go with whatever you currently have. I think Bookshelf is okay. Connects can work. Sequelize is, I haven't enjoyed Sequelize that much. I tried it briefly and I felt like it was easier to just write SQL queries themselves. And honestly, we're using Bookshelf at my day job and it often feels like I want to just stop fighting the ORM and go write a plain SQL query. Philip asks if when using Lambdas, would you be using RDS? Yes, in the book, we mostly, when we do need to store data, we use DynamoDB because it's simpler for tutorials, but I wouldn't recommend using DynamoDB unless you have a very specific reason for using DynamoDB in a real world project. I would recommend using Postgres on RDS, or Aurora is also very good. No, Aurora or Athena. Why do I get them mixed up? So AWS Aurora. Yes. So if you're using RDS, the downside of RDS is that it's not fully serverless. So while you can use your infrastructure as code and serverless framework to set up RDS, it is still a hosted instance that lives somewhere, and it's almost effortless to manage, but it is an actual thing that lives somewhere and doesn't scale to zero, which is one of the benefits of serverless. So Amazon Aurora is getting to the point where it's good enough that if you're building a new project, you can use Aurora as a serverless RDS. And the main difference there is that it can scale down to zero. So when nobody's using your code or your Lambdas, you're not paying anything for hosting. Personally, I haven't tried it. I've tried RDS directly, and that has worked really, really well with AWS Lambdas. But Aurora is also a good option nowadays. Does that answer your question, Philip? Cool. Thanks, Igor. I like that you like my work. Okay, so great question, Igor. Am I planning to share more of my life? Yes, it's an off-topic question, but I used to share more of my life, and then unfortunately, I'm gonna try to do more of that. I do some of that on Twitter, so if you follow me on Twitter, you get stuff. On my newsletter, I try to share when any highlights happen or something really fun and awesome. The problem I've had with sharing my life in the past is that there's only so many hours in the day, and I try to focus more on my teaching and sharing things that are aimed at people who want to learn from me rather than from people who just want more stories about me. I don't know, that might sound weird, but when you sit down to write an article and you can write an article that's going to work, it's going to teach somebody something, or an article that's just a fun story about yourself, usually writing the teaching article is a better use of your time. So that's kind of what's been happening over the last couple of years with my writing. If you look at the old areas of my blog, there used to be a lot more of just life stuff. And on my YouTube channel, I also used to post like an almost weekly life stuff thing. And then I just realized that my life isn't actually that interesting. But I do want to write more about the indie hacker life and side hustling and career stuff in general. I've been writing more about that. So we'll see. And Martin is asking, how do you see the serverless market in terms of developers and projects? Okay, so that's a kind of a difficult question to answer, Martin. It kind of depends on what you mean. If you're a developer, are you going to find work with work that's serverless? Yes, I think you will, but a lot of companies are still on non-serverless backends. That's why the Serverless Handbook, the tagline is, let me show you the tagline. I also don't want to misquote my own tagline. So the tagline is dive into modern backend, understand any backend. That's aimed at developers/engineers who are learning this stuff. You will learn how to build any sort of backend, serverless or not. You will have a better understanding of what it takes and how to think about it after reading this book. In terms of hiring serverless engineers, again, I think that it's relatively early days for serverless. So I think anyone who's currently billing themselves as a backend engineer should be able to pick up serverless relatively easily. There's also a lot of in-between spots. Like at my day job, we use Fargate instead of Lambda because Fargate allowed us to go serverless without changing our entire backend. We literally took our Express.js code base, packaged it in a Docker container, and put it on Fargate. So now it's technically serverless, but the development still feels as if it wasn't serverless. You have all of the same things. And it gives us a path forward to eventually migrate into the full serverless mindset. And it also kind of depends on what kind of project you're building. Some benefit more from serverless than others. But I think going forward, future looking, I think in 10 years, most typical websites and web apps are going to be serverless unless you're so big and have such a huge company and so much traffic that being serverless is just too expensive. Like you wouldn't put Facebook on serverless, for example, because they just have too much traffic and there's no point there. You don't benefit from serverless there. Whereas something like a side project or a web app that gets a couple thousand hits per day really benefits from serverless. Does that answer your question, Martin? Okay, cool. So I'm going to, it's been an hour. I'm going to end this. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to open my beer to really celebrate. Oh, nice. Okay, so Matthew, yeah, like Matthew said, the tools that I'm teaching in the Serverless Handbook are actually used in really large apps as well. So the mindset and stuff is going to be really helpful. I'm going to end now. Igor asks about model federation. Unfortunately, I don't have an opinion on Webpack 5. I have not played around with it yet. And I've mostly started thinking that I never want to configure my own Webpack and things like that anymore. I like to use pre-made configurations because I prefer building the actual code rather than fiddling endlessly with configurations. That's also why I teach serverless. So Philip also has a question about CI/CD on serverless. We talk about that a little bit in the Dev QA and prod chapter. Nice thing about serverless is because you're using infrastructure as code, you can deploy as many environments as you want. So you can then set up your CI/CD pipeline to automatically deploy a completely new copy of everything, run your tests, and then tear the copy down and deploy to production, which is a really nice benefit of serverless. So yeah, Serverless Handbook coming out to a Amazon link near you on March 31st. I will try to send a pre-order link later this week. If that doesn't happen, March 31st is it. And sign up on either go to serverlesshandbook.dev, sign up, and you'll be the first to know when the book launches, or rather when it's available for purchase. Thanks for hanging out. I will see you in the emails. Bye, everyone.